and all who inhabits it. This is my friend Cameron, a.k.a. Cammy B, a.k.a. Cameron Burt, a.k.a. Cameron Expletive Bonsell. Wave to the people. Let them know that you're here.
Hello. I'm sorry for the awkward view that we have going on right. So my camera is on the bottom left of my screen, and that was just the stupidest design choice I think I've ever seen.
That's all right. You can't control that. The people who design things are different than the people who fix things and the people who use things. So, because they never know what they're doing. That's just a fact. That's a fact of life. Anyone who fixes anything will tell you that. I'll tell you that. So, but anyway, I've called you here, Cameron, because you have to explain to me why analytic philosophy is so boring. And you have all the time you want. Why do we even care?
Wow. Go. Should we begin by defining analytic philosophy?
If you'd like to, you're the expert. I'm just out here.
Because I feel like if we just start off this podcast by saying what's good about analytic philosophy, the 99.9% of people who don't know what analytic philosophy is are just going to be really lost the whole time.
That's fair. So go ahead, define it.
Can you define it? Because I don't really know how to define it.
Really? That was your concentration? Really?
Yeah, but I feel like every time we talked about the analytic continental divide, it was just
fair enough.
I don't know. It's what analytic is what we do, and we think it's better.
Yeah.
But there's no.
So there's a debate about not only the definition of the two terms, but whether or not there's a divide at all. Some people would suggest that the only reason why there's a division between analytic philosophy and its counterpart, continental philosophy, is to, or on the people who do what I call the real philosophy. But that's beside the point. The point is there's a real superiority complex that comes with this divide, depending on what side you're on. So the people who've actually tried to technically define it in a good way or in an objective way would usually say something along the lines of analytic philosophy being focused in using some form of logic to define terms, derive arguments, and then from there better understand the world and whatever we're trying to do, whether it's metaphysics or ethics or metaethics, in a scientific or professional fashion. Whereas the continental people are really led by the phenomenologists, like our boy. Remember him?
I've never actually read Hegel.
Yeah, we gotta get on that. Some of y'all. Shout out Alves, are rude and just insult people that you don't like. But people like Hegel talk about things like the phenomenology and trying to understand the world from kind of what I think of as a bottom-up approach, just taking some of the raw and I guess sensory inputs from experience and from there trying to make sense of things. And there's a stylistic difference as well in how continental philosophers go about their business, because they aren't really interested in coming up with mathematical proofs so much as the analytics are, but rather they're trying to inject a sense of meaning and poetry and prose to the business of philosophy that the analytic people aren't necessarily as concerned with. I think that's a fair distinction.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair distinction. I think so. My defense of analytic philosophy is probably that I think on its own. Okay, I think both analytic and continental can be very useless, because I think one of the major criticisms, or a all-right criticism of continental philosophy, is that it can focus on what sounds deep rather than actually saying things of substance. And I think it can also turn into beginning an argument basically just assuming a conclusion and then almost like working back from that. And so sometimes it can just turn into these like really absurd, like when you have things like a feminist critique of science or something like that, and or like a more specific scientific theory, where it's just like that has no place in a scientific theory because it's science, and obviously there are assumptions that come in your science, and perhaps like the fact that it's been male dominated has affected the assumption. But like when it comes to things like physics, again, I don't even like very much about physics, but from what I do know about like fundamental physics, you can't really have like a certain demographic critique of it because it's just like it's math. And I don't know, I think it's fair to say like you can't really have like a certain critique of math. It's just like it's math, and then you need to figure it out through math. So I guess what I like about analytic philosophy is that it is more heavily focused on logical arguments, and so I think I think there's a certain extent to in analytic philosophy you can't like assume a conclusion and then work from there. Like you have to end up like you have to sort of follow arguments and logic. You to use a horrible cliche, you have to follow facts and logic. Even though you don't actually no, I take it back. You don't even have to follow facts because I don't think philosophy necessarily cares about facts, but you have to follow logic. And so I think might be a more honest approach to trying to find an answer to a problem because you're following a certain course of reasoning, and to a certain extent it's like unaffected by non-evidential factors, which may or may not be true. But I think analytic philosophy has a real downturn, like a real bad side, is that it can just turn. I think analytic philosophers want to imagine that you'll just be able to like find the answer to all of the world's questions through logic. And I just don't think that's the case. And so I think sometimes you'll find analytic philosophers want so badly to just get one thing right and just to like prove that one thing is true that they'll just get caught up in semantics and just be like tweaking like tiny insignificant things in each other's arguments, and at the end of the day they sort of get caught up in this madness of trying to find the correct answer to something, and they eventually just turn into like making semantic arguments against each other, or I think a perfect example is so stupid that happens in philosophy is Peter Unger's argument for skepticism, because he basically just says like, so let's define knowledge as something that can never ever be questioned, even if God came down and told you were wrong. And it's like, well, what do people think of when they think of knowledge? So you're saying we can't know anything, but you just put this like unrealistically high, like you've just defined knowledge in a way that like no one agrees with. So I don't know. I think that it can just get caught up in arguments, or like it can just get caught up in semantics and trying to get you to assume a definition that just isn't true. That
not to go down that rabbit hole, but I remember specifically that the reason why he defines knowledge with such a high bar like that is because he sets a conditional where if one has knowledge, then one is certain of whatever they claim to have knowledge of. And that seems, I think most people would argue, seems to be the case more likely than more often than not, such that, you know, if I make a claim that 2 + 2 is 4, but I'm not really sure of it and can't really explain to you how, for lack of a better phrase, then one might say, you know, Jabari is just saying 2 + 2 is 4, but does he really understand, and can he really claim to know that 2 + 2 is 4, because he's uncertain? And he seems to be kind of working backward from that idea of knowledge.
Yeah, but I think ultimately, though, that's the same thing, though. He's saying, okay, knowledge is being certain. And he puts this definition of like being certain, makes a definition that I think is farther than most people. Like, I think most people have a pragmatic view of what being certain is. And so it's just like, being certain is like, yeah, you're right. But like, are there these insane situations that like only a professional philosopher would ever imagine, in which you could be wrong? Yeah, sure, we'll give you that, but that doesn't mean we aren't certain. Like, that doesn't mean you should take away the definition of certainty.
Pragmatic in this guy's way, pragmatic in that way. You don't remember Peirce, do you?
I don't.
Jesus, I'm jealous of you a little bit, because that was a nightmare. But I'm sorry. Everyone knows that pragmatism is my favorite buzzword of all time. Whenever we talk about things like this, and you've known me long enough.
I think you need a certain level of pragmatism. I think everyone has a certain level of pragmatism.
Yeah.
Because, like, at the end of the day, like, that's like the thing. Is like, do you know anything in science? Maybe not, because maybe we can't be certain. But like, we've been getting really good things from it. So even if science doesn't like sort of align to the fundamental concept of truth, or like it doesn't perfectly align with the idea of truth that's like woven into the fabric of the universe, like, who cares? It's been getting us really good places, and so it's right.
Yeah.
You can't just say it's right. Like, obviously, like, there are ways in which it's wrong, and then there's whoever it was, like pessimistic induction that everything we believe is wrong because everything we have believed has been wrong. And it's sort of like you can trace back everything, like everything that we thought was certain was wrong in some sense. But I don't know, at the end of the day, like, if our beliefs get us somewhere really good, because I think you can make a very easy case that like being agnostic about everything is the most rational because you can't be wrong.
Right.
But like being agnostic about everything is kind of useless at the end of the day.
So knowledge is really a tool, a consequential tool to get you where you want to go, more or less.
I'm not like 100%. I don't think like I guess like a problem with, in my opinion, just being purely a pragmatist is that I think that's stating it too strongly. Like, I think that there is, and like, I guess, like with my like Christian beliefs, there is a certain extent to which I think you have to say there at least is like this concept of knowledge that, like, at the very least God has. But I think there's also an extent to which a lot of beliefs we have to just have a pragmatic view about it. Not saying that we can't know, but if you really look at like the level of certainty that it would take to know something 100%, like, I think for the most part that's a really unreasonable thing to ask of people. But at the end of the day, we're happy with it because it's like a good. I feel like a lot of our definitions are like good enough. Like, the knowledge that we have is good enough. Like, yeah, you can probably poke holes in like any belief that anyone has, but there are some that are so certain that I think they should just be considered like good enough for knowledge.
Fair enough.
But that's such a bold claim to make. And
what about being certain of things?
Yeah, like that. Like, a lot of my beliefs are very bold ones, which I'm not going to like spend my life trying to like be certain of. I just think, I don't know. To me, at least studying philosophy has made me probably slightly more of a pragmatist. But
yeah, I was going to ask you, so why do we study philosophy and why does it matter? Why do we care?
Question. I think when I started studying philosophy, I started studying it because I wanted to like know the right answers. And it's like it's really cliche, but I think Socrates, right, who says like the point of philosophy is like to know that you're not wise, or like the truly wise man like
Yeah,
knows he is wise. And I think that's like really insightful though. And I,
yeah.
like obviously that was probably really that was probably the coldest take of all time. That
No,
like
not really.
the
Not really.
Socrates quote that everyone quotes is really insightful, but I think it really is true. I think that sometimes people get caught up in philosophy as like the way to find all the right answers, and I think you can just like look at the level of disagreement that there is among like all professional philosophers, and that should make you question like, is this really the best way to find knowledge? Because the people who have made a profession of finding like sort of truth about the world, they all disagree with each other. And so I think that's like a very easy thought experiment that can say like, yeah, maybe philosophy isn't the best way to get knowledge. Um, but
Yeah, and it's
I
kind of
think it makes you more thoughtful. I think it shows you the limitation of knowledge. So I think in ways it's made me more certain about some things and then less certain about things that I shouldn't be certain about. And that's all right. And it really gives you an appreciation, in my opinion, for how hard it is to know something. Like when you try to figure out, just like when you try to figure out like what is truth, or try to figure out what does it mean to know something. I think the more you try to do something like that, and the longer you take trying to figure it out, assuming you don't just like read one book and decide that's right. Like I think if you really truly like honestly evaluate these arguments, you start to learn how hard it is to really know something, and it shows you just how complicated knowledge is. And I think that's a good thing, because I think it makes us more, or it should, like it probably doesn't always for me, but like it should make us more humble, and it should, even like today, like I think in our political climate that we have today, like everyone just hates the other side and thinks the other side is stupid. But like if you really thought about how hard it is to come to informed political views, and like you really evaluate the evidence and got like a appreciation for how complicated it is, I think we wouldn't hate each other, because be like, oh yeah, it is really complicated, and the chances that I'm right on everything are extremely slim, even if like I read the New York Times every week.
right.
So I don't know, I think it's helpful in that way, and just sort of giving you a better understanding of knowledge and how hard that is.
Okay, that's fair. I had a lot of different places to go from there. I think the first point you made about the importance of showing and understanding the limitations of knowledge is key for, number one, the development of faith, which is something that's, I know, is important to you, something that's important to me. It helps in one's humility as they deal with other people. And that's the broader sort of societal import of studying philosophy and embracing a more fallibilist view of knowledge, where we're willing to concede that sometimes I don't understand or see things from a different point of view. And because of that, I have to be more conciliatory and willing to listen and hear from somebody else who might be smarter than me in a particular area, as hard as it might be for one to admit that. And I think, to me, that's been the appeal lately to a lot of the philosophers that you probably don't like very much, like Foucault and Derrida and
Yeah, Derrida, I just had to read. I just have a personal vendetta against Derrida.
because he can't write, and I can see that he can't write, and most of what he says, like no one in his field really took him seriously, because like for the folks at home, like Derrida is a linguist. So like, but he like invaded the field of philosophy as kind of this really left leaning, probably leftist renegade, And now, like, all of the liberals and wannabe socialists are claiming him as a champion. But there's a reason, I think, why he has so much staying power is because he puts in this really pompous and arrogant way a relatively simple principle that I've been reading about and seeing it kind of iterate itself across different, how should I say, branches of study. And that principle is, moving away from centrality or the center and moving toward the margin. So the central authority or the consensus of how we analyze the world, and instead purposely moving ourselves to the extreme or to the edges where we find the standpoints that are different from us. Like, I don't know what it's like to be trans. I don't know what that's like. But if we're gonna be candid, I don't understand it. I mean, I don't get the process behind waking up one day and dissociating from your physical sex. But the sort of new postmodern thought kind of says, well, do we have some benefit in interrogating not only what is it like to wake up with those kinds of, I guess, impulses or deep identitarian issues, but even further than that, is there something like fundamental in the way that I analyze the world that's impressed not by some pure a priori concept, but by the man, the government, or by society that makes me analyze gender, for example, in this binary, or race in this binary? And I see your eyes glazing over.
No.
There you go, smile. But
I'm thinking about what you're saying.
It's because, like, even I kind of go like, okay, slow down when I read this stuff. But it's like, because in a way it's very meta, but in another way it's very kind of refreshing. And that's kind of been the appeal to the deconstructionist philosophy for me personally, because it's so applicable to, I think, the tenor of this country, where we are right now. Like, we are so, I guess, disaffected by everything going on around us, by the coronavirus. I'm tired. I can't watch the news anymore. I'm terrified of this damn virus. I mean, people are stroking out. People having heart attack. People got the corona feet. You heard about the corona feet? You get the liver spot on your foot. It's a whole bunch of stuff. And, with not just that, but you have the economic downturn, you have instability politically, and it's just so easy to cater to this impulse that wants to deconstruct and tear down, because it feels like, I think, among the populace, and it's very easy for me to feel personally that that's probably what needs to be done in some way, that we have to evaluate not just politics or the country as a juridical entity, but we have to evaluate also our personal selves to see in what way we as individuals bear responsibility for worldviews, ideas about race, about gender, about the economy, about how we deal with science that might contribute to our problems, because we're so messed up now in almost every way that it's hard to sit here and deny that we don't have a great deal of introspection to do. And I think the appeal to not just deconstructionism and like the Foucauldian way of analyzing things, but like continental philosophy, to me, has always been that continental philosophy is more adept and equipped to do that very thing and to engage in an introspective enterprise than analytic philosophy is. I mean, it's always been that way for me personally, because, continental philosophy has helped me to work through a lot of personal anguish, and it's the way by which I try to understand the world around me, kind of as a habit. But, I think, making it full circle, I think that's why I talk about philosophy so much. That's why I made you talk about why you like philosophy so much, because it's interesting to hear the different perspective and to see how it can motivate two different people who are different in a lot of ways to read a lot of similar stuff and then joke about why the other is wrong. But we agree a lot, so.
Sure. One of the things that, like, you bring up when you talk about the deconstructionist and like the sort of postmodern thought, that I think the problem ultimately is, I think that analytic might not always properly address the issue, because it's just like, we'll just like roll our eyes and be like, oh, okay, these morons, and don't really engage with it. And I think one of the big ideas in modern Western philosophy, which I think is just completely wrong, is like the whole Cartesian idea of like, we can just have like ideas through pure reason that are like that we can just sort of shed all the baggage that we have as humans and just reason as a mind machine.
It sounds like you listened to the last podcast that is using my line.
I actually didn't.
I know. Thinks he's slick.
But yeah, it's almost this idea that we can just get rid of, we can just like sort of reason as pure thinking beings and only examine the evidence and not be affected by outside factors. I think that's not correct. And I think that the thing that like postmodernism or all the deconstructionist theories have correct is that like there is an extent to which if men are doing all the science, right, there's probably going to be something that they're going to, or like if like rich white males are all doing science, there's probably something that they're going to miss, because there is just like an inherent, I think, and again, I don't have like numbers to back this up, but I do think there's like an inherent value to different perspectives, because different people will just pick up different things. And I remember like when we went to like feminist critiques of science, I personally found a lot of it to be kind of garbage. But like one of the things that they talk about, like one of the examples that I have is like there were scientists doing this experiment, and the thought was always that the males were just like dominant and they were sort of picking their mates. But then someone came in and sort of realized that actually like the females were doing a lot of manipulation. They were actually more involved in the process than people have thought, because they weren't just sitting by as like sort of passive agents, but they were in many ways manipulating the interactions through like making themselves like desirable, and sort of like they were more active in the process than people were giving them credit for. That's not like a problem with science. It was the fact that people were coming in with a certain point of view and sort of imposing that on all the research that they were doing. And so then you get a different point of view, and someone can look at that evidence in a different way, and then maybe they catch something else, and you're able to sort of reconcile those, or realize you're able to get like close to the truth by having that different point of reference, or that different perspective.
Right.
But I think that like the sort of deconstructionists and postmodern theories go too far, as in they just sort of like dissolve the idea of objective truth, and it's like everything is just purely based on like, and they usually pick, like they used to be like, it's sort of like Marxism, like you pick like one driving factor. You sort of say like you're just like, I'm going to read history through the lens of class struggle. It's like, well, you certainly should look at class struggle, but like you shouldn't just like paste that on everything. Or you can put it through like sexism. Like I'm just going to view everything through gender, everything through the perspective of race. And like ultimately just looking at, it's like if you decided to look at like the world through one lens, but just like decided that was the only lens you were going to look through. And I think the world is like a lot more confusing. And I almost think like people have started to realize how complicated the world is, and postmodernism is just like, it's just giving up. It's just saying like, it's just sort of throwing in the towel and saying like, no meta narratives. There's just like different people's truth. And again, there's a certain extent to which like perhaps like the truth of the world is going to be too complicated to be able to perfectly figure out and like put neatly in a book. But that doesn't mean you can just like throw out the concept. It could be that we won't ever be able to know what it is, or we'll never be able to fully articulate it. But I think they just sort of like drive us into chaos by abandoning all types of like meta narratives and the idea of some sort of outside truth that encapsulates everything. I think they just give up, and I think that's an issue.
I knew there's a reason why I called you. He's smart. If this was a radio station, I'd have a little applause button going. I think that hits the nail on the head. There's so many things you said that were really insightful. So I guess I'm gonna try to work backward, and I'm sure you'll say it again if I forgot something. Anyway, working backward, your first point I think was, or your most recent point was really smart. This idea of giving up on the truth. I think part of the genius that kind of separates what we talked about with pragmatism from postmodernism is this idea, especially in Peirce, where we never give up on the quest for knowledge, even if knowledge itself isn't as strong of a framework as the Cartesians or the Kantians would lend us to believe that it is, right? So in Peirce's, what should I say was it? I think it was How to Make Your Ideas Clear. He talks about the reality being that opinion which we are fated to believe in the future. So he adds this sort of modality to knowledge where we're always pursuing some final opinion somewhere at some point that we will reach, but don't really have in the present. And so this constant extension of the knowledge makes the pursuit of it still worthwhile, because we're going to get there, but we're just not there yet. And so like we have this idea of continuing to pursue these ideas of being able to know, or whatever we can get our hands on epistemically, such that we can be able to operate in the world and have ideas that are usable in that way, without just stopping and saying, well, there's some fundamentally broken things about how we process the world, and we're going to stop. And so like this need that we have for truth is so important, and we dispense with truth at our own peril. And we talked about in the last episode about post-truth and race, and how there's an interrelation between those two things. But what we really didn't talk about is like the danger of, I'm just gonna say his name. Can I say his name? Can I say the T word? You know the T word, Donald Trump. The danger of having a Donald Trump. He got scared. He thought I was gonna say something insensitive. The danger of having a Donald Trump as a president, who is the ultimate postmodern president, in that he's very casual with the truth and doesn't really care for it. I mean, at all. I mean, I think that's fair to say. And so when we throw it away, not only do we, like in the philosophical sense, give up looking for it because we just say it doesn't exist, but we get rid of something that's indispensable to the way we deal with our everyday life. Without some idea of truth or conception of truth, we can never function. We need to know that there is, in fact, a grocery store that we can go to get food. There has to be some general consensus that, stopping at the stoplight that does in fact exist is important for our safety. There are certain ideas that we all take as true, such that, the idea of truth itself can't be discarded unless we're all ready to run to our own perdition. And so truth is an important thing that the postmoderns are a little too casual with. And I think they take some of the conceptual weaknesses of knowledge and blow it up too far. And I think we can agree on that. Now, another thing you said about, it's really a critique about, I think, identity politics, where you talked about the feminist critique of science, for example. you said the one article you enjoyed. Can you shout it out? Do you remember the title? No, that's okay. Well, wherever you are, man, woman, boy, girl, whoever you are, we shout you out in spirit. Amen. Amen. Light. You're not gonna talk back to the preacher. That's fine. Cam has this battle with me that he never says amen when I tell him to say amen because he thinks I do it too much. But whatever. But I'm preaching good. Anyway, I'm preaching good. But so you mentioned this article, this feminist critique of science, and really the article that you pointed to that you said you enjoyed really doesn't point at gender per se at all. It just points at the importance of diversity of thought, right? And that's the brilliance of this book by my man, Professor Eddie Glaude, In a Shade of Blue. He talks about a similar thing with race, where when we talk about things like gender and race, we have this tendency to think of it as this category of essential characteristics that members of the category share with one another. So, the term I think for it is biological essentialism, where, you're a woman if you have these traits, you're Black if you have these traits, you're white if you have these traits. And the problem with that is you start to analyze things and look at them, as you put, too narrowly. And you start to cut out, I think, the complexity and the broadness of who we are. And I think you end up making a lot of silly mistakes when you end up making the sorts of claims that could be accused of being sexist or racist, when you are trying to use the tool of analysis to fight sexism and fight racism. It's silly to use this sort of essentialist framework for gender, for example, to analyze what is perceived to be, and statistically what is, a male-dominated profession, to make the claim, well, this is why it's male-dominated, because females wouldn't come to that conclusion. Well, why wouldn't females come to that conclusion? Is there something innate in them that wouldn't allow them to, or is it something experiential? And if we want to talk about different perspectives, it's important not to fall into the trap of relying on, some innate characteristic that classifies people along racial lines or gender lines, but to instead just focus on experience and experience alone, understanding that things like race and gender exist, but not in a deep metaphysical level that we often think of when we talk about these things. They exist on a practical level or a political reality. Another book I'm reading by Glaude, he just released it, Begin Again, goes into depth with this problem about analyzing race, understanding that race in itself is a social construct, gender is a social construct. So there's some things about it that are real in a political sense, but they aren't real in a deterministic or metaphysical sense. And so we have to learn, how to use race, how to understand it in a way such that we can address problems of racism and sexism without implying in our writings, in our argumentation, that race or sex determines who you are, what you believe by virtue of having a certain genitalia or having a certain hue. And so, I know that was a lot from just that one point you made about that one article, but I think that one article that you mentioned really kind of exposes itself, the problems of analyzing or putting on this, feminist critique of science hat without really defining the terms, which is where analytic boys like you come in and have to put us in check. Because, to have just a feminist perspective, it's important to talk about what exactly that means. And if we mean in a sense that it's feminism, or to be effeminate is to have this transcendent quality that determines our behavior, then we run afoul of the very kinds of freedoms that we try to win for ourselves and other people using these kinds of analytical tools or frames of analysis. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I said a lot. What time is it, Bert?
It is. So we got 15 minutes.
Okay. I know we're moving. What else? Did you say anything else that I need to shout out?
I don't think so.
I'm sure you did, because you said a lot of good stuff.
Appreciate it.
You did. You made a really good point. So we talked about, disposing of the truth and kind of giving up on truth, and talked about, I think the point that you're also making is, we can have diversity, and diversity is very important, but it's really diversity of thought that we're after. And I kind of sound like a conservative when I say that, but I think that's important. And perhaps
I feel also like diversity of experience, though. Like, it's not to say that, like, I don't know, like, the extent. Like, I don't really know, like, the whole factors, how people think. But I think at the end of the day, like, along racial, like, I don't know that there's necessarily something in race that, like, really shifts how you think, like, just on its own. Like, having a skin color doesn't, like, change your brain. But I do think that there's an importance. Like, I think there's a certain level to which, like, it's not just well, I mean, I guess you ultimately want diversity of thought, but I think you want to have, like, if you're at college, and this is why I personally defend the idea of, like, I don't think you should just have as a college or a university, you shouldn't just say, like, these are academic standards and nothing else. Like, I think you should try to get a diverse background, because I think there's something inherently useful to having, like, diversity of experience. And just, like, even if we both, like, have the same income level, like, as someone who's Black and for me as someone who's white, we're going to have a different experience. It could be, like, we could be extremely similar as people, but ultimately there is across racial lines, especially, I mean, I don't know, like, how it is everywhere in the world, but in America, different races just tend to have different experiences. And I think there's something inherently useful to having, like, people who have had those different experiences. And I think just, like, in making you a more well-rounded person, that's why I think identity politics goes too far in saying, okay, like, you're Black, so these are the things you have to believe. Like, I think that's absurd. And I do think that in some sense that is what, like, if we want to talk about the millennial left, like, I do think that they've, like, sort of created these boxes.
Trademark.
They sort of, like, created these boxes that you have to fall in. I think that's stupid, but I also think there's a certain extent to where if you want to say, like, be like, the American experience is exactly the same for everyone else, and, like, if I got out of poverty or something like that, like, they should be able to get out of poverty. And, like, I think when we don't think about the world from other people's perspectives, we can end up with somewhat ignorant policies, and, like, a somewhat ignorant dialogue. Because it is, again, it's, like, sort of a cliche, but if I'm like, hey, man, like, I don't think systemic racism exists in any, like, I've been doing fine. Like, that's just an ignorant position. And so I think we need to be able to interact. I think ultimately, like, there's an extent to which we need empathy, but ultimately I think we just need to interact with people who have different experiences than us. And so I don't think it's entirely thought diversity that you want, but while, like, diversity of thought is very important, but I think also just, like, diversity of experience and understanding that there are many factors about you that shape your world. And
diversity of thought is important insofar as, how you think about the world is shaped by your experience. I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And in that same way, race race doesn't necessarily add diversity insofar as we define race as the color of your skin. We want more people of color in places because with the different hues, the different cultures, you're going to have different experiences and you're going to have different ways of thinking. They may not all be the same. They're not monolithic. You're not going to have a common way of thought within Black people or within Hispanic people. I like how you're smiling because you know that applies to me. But you're going to have differences that are important as we go about making sense of our world and making it more just when we're including those different perspectives. Is that a fair summation of the point? Okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. Man, I wish we had more time. The hour flew by. You wanna make a final statement about truth, justice, in the American way?
We should just be more understanding, and I can learn a lot from that because I feel like I have my own position, my own areas where I'm very like already stuck in my ways, even though I certainly don't know enough to be stuck in my ways. And having an informed political view, I think, is something that is so complicated that it should be hard to get to a point where you're stuck in your ways. But I think we should just try to like genuinely be open-minded. And I think being open-minded has sort of been, again, like co-opted by like one group who sort of has their views of what being open-minded means. But I think we could really benefit by, as just like as a group or as a society, just being more genuinely open-minded and understanding where everyone's coming from, even if they have views that you personally find horrifying, or if they have views that personally you haven't experienced. I think we do better off listening to each other and and having some humility.
That's the thing that you said earlier that was really insightful. When you talked about Marxism, for example, and analyzing it just along one dimension, you lose a lot of the complexity. I mean, that's basically what you're saying now. Just not in a way that's as limited to a discipline or a mode of analysis, but just more broadly in how you live your life. Try to look at things from more than one place and in more than one way.
I think that like the way we consume media, and I think media in general just makes it sort of seem like there's an obvious right answer, right? Like I can watch a 10-minute video by Ben Shapiro and now I understand exactly, like I understand what the struggles in this country are. I totally understand the narrative, and I understand that, like, because he cited a couple of statistics, like I just understand why we need more police or something like that. And I think on the other hand, you can be like, oh, I like read a Vox article and now I understand why, like just like some like normal thing is a really oppressive thing that like like what. Or there's the classic like Vox after Obama won being like the Electoral College was the most amazing thing, and then after Trump won being like this is an institution meant to hold down people. So like I think we just like think we can read like one article and then fully understand an issue, and just that like knowledge is such a complicated thing that I think we would be benefited by understanding. Like when I read an article or watch a video that claims to explain everything to me, there's probably a lot of issues with it. And it's probably gonna take me a really long time to have anything like resembling an informed view on it.
Camembert, you just summed up the entire episode. I think that's the title right there. It's knowledge is a complicated thing. That makes a lot of sense. And well, I don't want to hold you. I know you're busy. I want to thank you for joining me, even though I am the way that I am.
No, thank you for having me. I'm excited to do it.
I know you're pumped. He's been bugging me, y'all. He's been like, when am I going to get my cameo? And I'm like, well, whenever you're ready. So
I haven't gotten to talk about philosophy in a few months. So
the next time you call, we got to talk about God. We can talk about God.
Issue.
Yeah, that's fine. That's what we're here for. To talk about God.
I'll give my feminist critique of God.
Oh, they're not gonna like that face I just made. Well, oh well. Oh yeah, because we should do that actually because I got some things to say on that. Oh my Lord. All right, till next time. I'm gonna see y'all when I see you. Until then, what's the slogan? You don't know our tagline now. It's stay wordy, stay nerdy, and keep your pages colorful. Isn't that smart?
I like that.
There you go.